There are stories buried so deep, most people never hear them. Stories so unsettling, so strange, that they're quietly pushed aside. Not because they were solved, but because no one wanted to face them. This is one of those stories. It began like a whisper, a small headline, a fleeting rumor. But as the years passed, fragments resurfaced. Chilling details, unanswered questions, and a silence that spoke louder than any explanation. And here's the disturbing truth. The more you look into it, the more it feels less like a mystery and more like a warning. Why did witnesses stop talking? Why were records suddenly locked away? And why, even today, does this case feel like something people want you to forget? Tonight, we're reopening the file. We're piecing together what was almost erased. And by the end, you might understand why some mysteries don't fade. They're buried. Chapter 1: The Forgotten File. It's strange how some of the most disturbing stories don't dominate headlines, don't live forever in documentaries, don't even make it into textbooks. Instead, they vanish. They're tucked away into dusty archives, spoken of in fragments, and eventually forgotten. This case is one of them. Back when it first surfaced, it was treated almost like a small-town curiosity. A few reporters picked it up, locals whispered about it in coffee shops, and investigators filed their standard reports. Nothing about it screamed national story at first glance. But underneath those surface-level accounts, something darker was brewing. Details too disturbing to print, questions too dangerous to press. And then, silence. Newspaper clippings stopped. Files were boxed away. People who once swore they'd seen something refused to speak another word. It wasn't that the case was solved. It was that it was swallowed whole. What makes it more unsettling is the deliberate absence. When you search for answers, you don't just find gaps. You find erased lines, missing pages, contradictions that don't add up. Almost as if someone, somewhere, decided this story shouldn't be remembered. But forgotten mysteries have a way of clawing their way back into the light. And once you start digging, you quickly realize, maybe they were buried for a reason. Chapter 2: Whispers of an Incident. It began with whispers, not headlines, not official statements, just whispers. A neighbor telling another what they thought they heard. A shopkeeper swearing they saw something unusual late at night. A child repeating a story overheard from frightened adults. These were the first ripples of what would grow into one of the strangest mysteries the town had ever faced. At first, the whispers were easy to dismiss. Strange noises in the dark? Probably just animals. A flicker of lights where there shouldn't be any? Faulty wiring, maybe. But the details started stacking up, and soon the maybes didn't feel so convincing anymore. People spoke of sudden blackouts, of figures moving in places no one should have been. Some recalled hearing cries, human they thought, that stopped as abruptly as they began. Yet no one wanted to admit it too loudly, because saying it out loud meant you believed it. And belief meant responsibility. But as rumors grew, so did unease. The whispers carried with them not just curiosity, but a quiet fear. Something had happened, everyone sensed it, but no one could agree on what. And in mysteries like these, whispers aren't just background noise. They're warnings. Warnings of something about to spill over. Chapter 3: The Vanishing Act. Every mystery has a turning point. That moment when curiosity shifts into something far more unsettling. In this case, it was the disappearances. At first, they didn't seem connected. A man who claimed to have seen strange lights failed to show up for work. A woman who told friends she was going to speak with reporters suddenly stopped answering her phone. A teenager, known for exaggerating stories, vanished after swearing he'd captured something on camera. Individually, you might chalk it up to coincidence. People move away, lives change, families keep secrets. But when it happened again, and again, people started to notice the pattern. Those who spoke too much, those who seemed closest to the truth, they were the ones who vanished. The official explanations came quickly. Relocations, accidents, misunderstandings. But the town didn't buy it. Not entirely. How many accidents could stack up in such a short time? How many misunderstandings could silence the very people who promised answers? And maybe the most chilling part wasn't who disappeared, but how the community reacted. Instead of outrage, there was silence. Instead of protests, whispers. It was as if fear itself had pressed down on the town, convincing everyone to stay quiet. Because if talking about the mystery made people vanish, who would dare speak next? Chapter 4. Locked Records. When people started asking hard questions, they were told to look at the official files. After all, that's where the answers should have been. Reports, witness statements, evidence logs, the kind of paper trail that makes sense of chaos. But when curious eyes finally reached those records, what they found wasn't clarity. It was absence. Pages missing, statements blacked out, entire sections sealed with no explanation. The deeper you searched, the more it felt like reaching into a box that had already been emptied. Some investigators whispered about classified reasons, though no one could say what could possibly justify it. Others suggested sloppy handling, as though years of paperwork had simply gone missing. But the precision of the gaps told another story. These weren't random oversights. These were deliberate cuts. One file in particular stood out. A witness account, brief, shaky handwriting, describing something unusual on the night of the incident. The last page, the one where the details should have come together, was gone. Torn clean out. And that was the moment suspicion hardened into certainty. The silence wasn't natural. The missing pages weren't mistakes. Someone didn't just want the mystery buried. They were making sure it stayed that way. But locked records have a way of drawing more attention. And the harder the truth is hidden, the more people are willing to risk everything to find it. Chapter 5. A Town Haunted. Even when the headlines disappeared and the files were sealed, the town itself couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. It lingered in the air, like a shadow you couldn't see but always felt. At night, streets emptied earlier than before. Families locked their doors not out of habit, but out of fear. Neighbors stopped chatting on porches, stopped asking questions, stopped sharing stories. It was as though silence had become the only form of safety. Yet, the unease seeped into everything. Children whispered about places they weren't supposed to go, daring each other to walk past certain abandoned houses or empty fields. Adults avoided those same places, glancing away whenever the subject was raised. The unspoken rule was simple. Don't bring it up. Don't tempt it back. Businesses struggled, too. Visitors sensed the tension and kept their distance. Locals who once took pride in their community now carried a quiet shame, as though the mystery was a stain no one could scrub away. And in a way, the town itself became a witness. Its silence, its empty streets, its lingering fear. All of it told the story that officials tried so hard to erase. Because no matter how much you bury a mystery, you can't bury the way it haunts the people who lived through it. Chapter 6. Unsettling Testimonies. For years, most people kept quiet. Fear had a way of sealing lips tighter than any official order. But eventually, a few couldn't hold it in any longer. And when they spoke, their words only deepened the unease. One woman recalled waking in the middle of the night to a sound she couldn't place. Not an animal, not a machine, but something she described as human, but not quite. She swore it came from just beyond the tree line near her home. And when she stepped outside, the air smelled metallic, sharp, like burned wires. Another man, older now but still shaken, remembered lights. Not headlights, not lanterns, but beams cutting through the dark in complete silence. He admitted he wanted to call the police, but something inside him told him not to. Like it wouldn't matter, he said. Then there were the children, grown up now, who admitted they'd seen figures where there shouldn't have been any. One described them as too still, another as watching but not moving. Each account was different, yet they all shared one thing: discomfort. These weren't exaggerated campfire tales told for attention. These were quiet, reluctant confessions from people who wished they could forget. And unsettling as they were, the testimonies revealed something chilling. The silence wasn't because nothing happened. It was because too much had. Chapter 7. The Silence of Officials. When strange stories ripple through a town, people naturally turn to authority for answers. Police, local leaders, even regional officials. Someone is supposed to step forward, calm the fears, and explain what happened. But here, their silence spoke louder than words. At first, there were vague reassurances. Officials said everything was under review or being looked into. A few public statements dismissed the events as misunderstandings, exaggerations, or simply local gossip. Yet, behind closed doors, those same officials were meeting far more often than usual. Files were being passed hand to hand instead of left in drawers. Reports were stamped confidential without clear reason. For many townspeople, it wasn't what officials said that stood out. It was what they didn't say. They dodged specifics, never directly addressed the missing witnesses, and seemed oddly eager to steer conversations away from the topic altogether. The harder the questions, the quieter the responses. And in that quiet, suspicion grew. Was it incompetence, fear, or something deeper, an effort to keep people from knowing too much? When the very people meant to protect a community refuse to give answers, it leaves only one conclusion. Either they don't know, or they know far more than they're willing to admit. Chapter 8: Patterns in Shadows. The strangest thing about this case is that, once you start digging, you realize it doesn't stand alone. Scattered across different towns, different years, even different countries, you find echoes. Similar disappearances. Similar silences. Similar trails that suddenly go cold. Historians point to an unsettling pattern. Events that begin small, almost ordinary, before spiraling into something unexplainable. A few strange sounds. A sudden blackout. A handful of witnesses who swear they saw something. Then, almost predictably, the vanishing of those who speak too loudly. And finally, the official silence. The files sealed. The memory erased. It's like watching shadows stretch across a map, disconnected at first glance, but eerily similar when placed side by side. Were these isolated incidents, or fragments of a larger picture no one wants to acknowledge? What's even more disturbing is how the pattern repeats with precision, almost like a script. The details change: a rural farm here, an industrial site there, a suburban neighborhood somewhere else. But the outcome always feels the same. Fear, confusion, erasure. And maybe that's the scariest part, because if it happened here, and there, and over there, then what are the chances it could happen again? Patterns aren't accidents. They're warnings. The question is, who or what is writing them? Chapter 9: The Skeptic's Lens. Not everyone believes the whispers, the disappearances, or the locked files point to something sinister. Skeptics argue that what looks like mystery is often just messy reality. People move away without notice all the time. Records get lost in understaffed offices. Memories twist over time, and fear can make shadows look like monsters. One psychologist suggested that the town had fallen into what he called a collective narrative. In other words, once the first strange story spread, the rest began filling in the blanks. Lights in the sky became ominous instead of mundane. Silence from officials felt like a cover-up instead of bureaucracy. In this view, the mystery wasn't in the events themselves, but in how people interpreted them. And its true fear is contagious. A single rumor can ripple through an entire community, shaping perception, making the ordinary feel extraordinary. Skeptics point to dozens of cases throughout history where hysteria grew out of nothing more than miscommunication and imagination. But here's the problem. Even when you strip away exaggerations, too many questions remain. Too many people vanished. Too many records were sealed. Too much silence surrounded the case. So, are the skeptics right? Is this all a story blown out of proportion? Or is their doubt just another layer of the cover? A distraction from the truth? Chapter 10: The Contradictions. Every official account told a neat, simple story. But when you compared them side by side, the cracks appeared immediately. Witness statements didn't line up. Reports contradicted one another. Even the timelines seemed to twist out of shape, like puzzle pieces forced together where they didn't belong. One report said the blackout lasted 12 minutes. Another claimed it was closer to an hour. Witnesses described seeing figures in places that, according to the records, were completely empty. A police log mentioned a call made at 10:42 p.m., but phone records placed that same call nearly half an hour later. And then there were the disappearances. Some files claimed individuals had simply moved out of state, but relatives swore they never arrived at their supposed new addresses. Others were listed as accidental deaths. Yet no death certificates could be found. The contradictions piled higher the closer you looked. And contradictions aren't just errors, they're signals. They tell you someone is lying, or at the very least, someone is hiding something. If the truth was as simple as the official story claimed, there would be no need for missing pages, altered times, or conflicting testimony. The contradictions didn't close the case. They blew it wide open. Chapter 11, A Stranger Theory. For some, the contradictions pointed not just to human error or cover-ups, but to something stranger. A theory that slipped beyond the edges of what people were comfortable believing. It began with the lights. Too bright, too precise, too silent to be explained away as faulty power lines or passing vehicles. Witnesses described beams that cut through the dark like surgical blades, hanging in the air without a sound. No engineis, no explanation. Then there were the figures. Not everyone saw them, but those who did struggled to describe them in human terms. Too still, one said, like mannequins, but breathing. Another swore they were tall, impossibly tall, watching from the tree line. Combine those details with the disappearances and the locked records, and a chilling possibility emerges. Maybe this wasn't about human secrecy at all. Maybe what happened that night was something outside our control, something not meant to be understood. Of course, skeptics dismiss this immediately. They argue people see what they want to see, especially when fear clouds their minds. But others believe the strangeness of the evidence is exactly why it was buried. Because if the truth was too disturbing, too unexplainable, silence might have been the only option. And that silence raises the question, what if the real danger wasn't what happened, but who or what caused it? Chapter 12, The Media Blackout. If there's one thing mysteries thrive on, it's attention. Headlines, late-night debates, breaking news. But here's the strange part. After a few short weeks, the coverage of this case all but disappeared. It wasn't just that the media lost interest. It was as if the story had been deliberately cut off. Early reports hinted at an unusual disturbance and community-wide concern. A handful of journalists tried to dig deeper, interviewing locals, gathering statements. But just as the momentum was building, silence. Newspapers stopped running follow-ups. Radio hosts moved on to safer topics. Television stations pulled segments before they aired. One reporter later admitted her editor told her to drop it, though no reason was given. Another claimed his notes went missing after leaving them in the newsroom overnight. Coincidence? Maybe. But too many coincidences add up to a pattern. And that's what this blackout felt like, intentional. Someone somewhere wanted the noise to die down. Because the less the public heard, the less pressure there was to explain. But silence doesn't erase memory. Locals still whispered. Families still feared. And the sudden disappearance of coverage only added another layer to the unease. Because when the media goes quiet, the question isn't just why. It's who told them to stop talking. Chapter 13, Private Letters. When official records vanish and newspapers go silent, the truth sometimes hides in unexpected places. In this case, it was letters, private, handwritten exchanges between families who lived through the ordeal. They weren't meant for the public. Most were simple updates. A sister writing to her brother in another state, parents checking in with distant relatives. But scattered within them were lines that stopped historians cold. One letter described a night of terror, though it never clarified what had caused it. Another mentioned figures at the edge of the property and the fear that they might return. One particularly haunting note simply read, "We are not supposed to talk about it. Please don't ask again." What makes these letters chilling isn't just what they say, it's what they don't. The vague wording, the unfinished sentences, the moments where the writer clearly pulled back, afraid to put details on paper. It's the silence between the lines that feels heaviest. To this day, the families who wrote them rarely speak publicly. But the letters remain, fragile pieces of paper carrying weight that no official report ever could. Because while files can be sealed and news can be censored, a hurried note between loved ones tells the story officials tried so hard to bury. Chapter 14, The Investigator Who Stayed. In every forgotten case, there's usually at least one person who won't walk away. someone who refuses to accept silence as an answer. For this mystery, that person was a local investigator, a name barely remembered outside the town, but whispered with respect among those who still care. When others filed their reports and moved on, he kept digging. He interviewed families long after the headlines disappeared. He collected scraps of evidence others considered useless: broken watches, burned-out bulbs, scraps of torn clothing. He kept meticulous notes, filling notebooks with questions no one else dared ask. But his persistence came at a cost. Friends distanced themselves, fearful of being associated with him. Officials labeled him an obsessive, dismissing his work as rumor-chasing. And yet, every time he was told to stop, he dug deeper. Over the years, he became the guardian of the story. While files vanished and records were sealed, his notes survived. Smuggled into basements, hidden in boxes, passed quietly from hand to hand. Without him, much of what we know today would have been lost. He wasn't chasing fame or fortune. He was chasing truth, even when it put him in the shadows. And maybe that's why his work still matters, because in the face of fear and silence, he refused to let the mystery be forgotten. Chapter 15: Fragments of Evidence. The official records may have been sealed, but thanks to the investigator who refused to walk away, fragments of evidence survived. Small, scattered pieces, but when placed together, they formed a picture far more unsettling than any official report admitted. One of the most curious finds was a collection of broken watches. Each had stopped at nearly the same time on the night of the incident, as though the moment itself had short-circuited the machines. Power surges could explain it, but why only those particular watches? Then there were light bulbs, shattered not from being dropped, but from burning too hot, too fast, as if something had overloaded them beyond their limits. Some locals even claimed entire strings of bulbs popped all at once, plunging homes into instant darkness. Scraps of fabric also surfaced, torn and scorched in strange patterns. Forensic testing later revealed chemical residues that didn't match any household substance from the area. To this day, their origin remains uncertain. Individually, none of these fragments prove anything, but together, they tell a story of disturbance, of something powerful, disruptive, and far beyond coincidence. And that's the unnerving part. The closer you look at the evidence, the less ordinary it seems, almost as if reality itself buckled, leaving behind scars too strange to ignore. Chapter 16: A Pattern of Fear. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, creeping into everyday life until it becomes impossible to ignore. In this town, fear followed a pattern, almost like a second, invisible shadow cast over every street and home. It started with the small things. People avoided certain roads after dark. Children were warned not to wander near empty fields. Even familiar neighbors stopped visiting each other after sunset. There was a collective, unspoken agreement. Don't tempt what lurks beyond. Then came the whispers that no one wanted to repeat aloud. Stories of figures in the woods, sudden cold spots in rooms, unexplained sounds echoing at night. Those who saw them rarely reported them, fearing ridicule or worse. The pattern extended to families. Parents instructed children not to mention anything unusual. Adults questioned their own sanity, doubting what they had seen. And yet, the more people tried to ignore it, the more the fear seemed to grow. By the time journalists and investigators tried to return, the town itself was marked. Silence wasn't just compliance, it was survival. And the fear had a strange way of reinforcing itself, each frightened glance and hushed conversation strengthening the invisible boundaries around the mystery. Because in this case, fear didn't just follow the events. Fear became the event, shaping memory, behavior, and the very way the town remembered or forgot what happened. Chapter 17: Pop Culture Echoes. Even when a mystery is buried, it has a way of resurfacing, sometimes in the most unexpected places. In this case, whispers of the incident found their way into films, books, and local folklore, echoing through pop culture in ways few could trace back to the original event. A horror novelist, for example, wrote about a small town where lights appeared in the forest and children vanished in the night. Locals who read it whispered nervously, recognizing fragments of what they'd lived through, though names and dates were changed. A documentary briefly mentioned a series of unexplained blackouts and vanished witnesses, never naming the town but weaving details that matched exactly. Even songs carried subtle references, lyrics describing watching figures in the dark or hours frozen on broken clocks. For those who experienced the events firsthand, these echoes were chilling reminders. Someone, somewhere, remembered. But here's the strange part. To the general public, these cultural nods were entertaining, intriguing, or spooky. Few realized they were glimpses of a real, living mystery. The story had transformed, passing from lived experience into legend, leaving the truth obscured but never entirely gone. Pop culture didn't solve the mystery. It didn't explain the disappearances or unlock the sealed files. But it did ensure that the story lingered, subtle, unsettling, and waiting for someone to connect the dots. Chapter 18: Warnings Ignored. Every mystery carries a warning, often hidden in plain sight. In this case, the signs were clear. Strange occurrences, vanishing witnesses, shattered evidence, and the growing fear that gripped the town. Yet, despite these signals, few outside the immediate area paid attention. Authorities dismissed early reports as exaggerations. Media outlets moved on to the next trending story. Even residents, wary of ridicule or worse, chose to stay silent. Each ignored warning became a thread in a larger web of oversight, leaving the community vulnerable and unprepared for what might follow. The investigator who stayed behind repeatedly tried to sound alarms, documenting patterns, collecting evidence, and urging officials to act. His warnings were met with polite nods, bureaucratic delays, and, eventually, indifference. He noted in his journals, "The most dangerous thing is not what we don't know, but what we choose to ignore." The tragedy, if it can be called that, wasn't just the events themselves, it was the failure to recognize their significance. Each overlooked clue, each dismissed account, contributed to the mystery's endurance, allowing fear and uncertainty to fester instead of being addressed. History is full of warnings ignored, but rarely with such eerie, lasting consequences. In this town, the lessons were unheeded, and that silence became another haunting layer of the story. Chapter 19: Theories Resurface. Years of silence can't bury curiosity forever. Even when files are sealed, witnesses vanish, and media coverage dies, questions linger, and eventually, theories resurface. That's exactly what happened with this case. As fragments of evidence reappeared, a recovered letter here, a witness testimony there, people began to connect dots that had long been ignored. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Amateur investigators pored over maps, timelines, and the scraps of reports that survived. Every discrepancy, every unexplained detail became fuel for renewed debate. Some suggested natural explanations, electrical malfunctions, hallucinations, or coincidences amplified by fear. Others leaned toward something far darker, intentional manipulation, cover-ups, or forces beyond comprehension. Each theory carried its own weight, but none could fully explain all the contradictions. And that's what made the resurgence so compelling. The story didn't fit neatly into a single explanation. The more people dug, the more layers they uncovered. It was like peeling an onion. Every layer revealed another, stranger mystery beneath. Even skeptics were forced to reconsider fragments they had once dismissed. Because while the details remained incomplete, the patterns were undeniable. Something unusual had occurred, and the refusal to let the story go quietly meant the truth, or at least a piece of it, was finally clawing its way back into the light. Chapter 20: Disturbing Coincidences. Sometimes, the strangest mysteries aren't just unsettling on their own. They intersect with other incidents in ways that defy chance. This case is no exception. Researchers began noticing patterns that seemed almost too precise. Blackouts occurring at similar times in unrelated towns. Witnesses describing figures with the same unusual behaviors. Reports of shattered or stopped clocks, scattered across locations that had no connection except the uncanny resemblance in events. Skeptics might call them coincidences, but the more examples that appeared, the harder it was to dismiss them as random. One investigator noted in his journal, "When too many threads align, it stops being a tapestry of coincidence and starts being a warning." Even minor details amplified the eeriness. Locations that appeared harmless by day became places of fear after dark. People reported the same metallic smell in distant areas. Descriptions of movements, deliberate, silent, and inexplicable, were mirrored by individuals who had never met. The coincidences weren't just strange. They were disturbing because they suggested connection. Whether intentional or not, the events seemed to follow a pattern, a rhythm that couldn't be explained by chance alone. And that's what haunted researchers the most. If these patterns repeat across time and place, then perhaps the mystery is far bigger, far stranger, and far more persistent than anyone had imagined. Chapter 21, A Survivor's Story. Amidst all the whispers, vanished witnesses, and sealed files, there is one voice that stands out, a survivor who experienced the night firsthand. Their story isn't just chilling. It offers a perspective that no document or rumor could ever capture. The survivor recalls the night in fragments. A sudden hush that fell over the town, lights appearing in places they shouldn't, and a silence so heavy it pressed against the skin. It wasn't just dark, they explained. It felt alive, watching. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow stretched unnaturally. They saw things others never would. Figures that moved without sound. Shapes that flickered at the edge of vision. And then came the fear that no one could put into words. The understanding that what was happening wasn't ordinary, and that questions could be dangerous. For years, they kept quiet, terrified of being disbelieved, ridiculed, or worse. Only decades later did they agree to speak, cautiously, in hushed tones. And even then, they revealed only fragments, enough to shake belief but not enough to explain everything. Their testimony confirms one haunting truth. The night was not only real, it was transformative. It changed the town, altered the lives of those who survived, and left questions that remain unanswered to this day. Because sometimes, survival itself becomes a story, the story the world isn't ready to hear. Chapter 22, A Web of Secrecy. What happens when too many pieces of a story are hidden, distorted, or erased? You get a web of secrecy, a tangle of omissions, half-truths, and silences that makes uncovering the truth almost impossible. In this case, the web stretched across the town and beyond. Officials sealed files. Witnesses disappeared or were silenced. Families withheld details to protect themselves or loved ones. Even local journalists who tried to dig deeper were warned off or reassigned. Every thread pulled seemed to meet another obstacle, another closed door. The investigator who stayed behind noted how carefully the secrecy was maintained. Records vanished, letters were intercepted, and key evidence seemed to slip from hands before it could be examined. It was as if someone or something was watching, making sure the story didn't escape the shadows. And yet, the secrecy didn't entirely succeed. Fragments survived, whispers persisted, and a few brave voices refused to be silenced. But the gaps remain. Every missing detail adds tension, every contradiction fuels suspicion, and every unanswered question deepens the mystery. The web of secrecy isn't just about hiding facts. It shapes perception, leaving the public to fill in the blanks with fear, speculation, and imagination. And sometimes, those blanks are more terrifying than the truth itself. Chapter 23, Where the Truth Slipped. In every long-buried mystery, there comes a point where the truth begins to leak. Small cracks, unnoticed by most, but visible to those who know where to look. In this case, the truth slipped through in fragments, contradictions, and unexplained anomalies. One such crack appeared in the testimony of a long-forgotten witness, whose account conflicted with the official timeline. Another surfaced in a partially destroyed file that hinted at events far stranger than the public had ever known. And then there were the physical traces, the broken watches, scorched bulbs, and torn fabrics. Evidence that no report could adequately explain. Each slip created tension between what was recorded and what was real. The authorities' version of events couldn't account for every anomaly, and the townspeople's stories didn't match the sanitized narrative either. The gaps became spaces for fear, speculation, and imagination to grow, turning uncertainty into almost tangible dread. And yet, the truth wasn't entirely lost. The fragments, while incomplete, offered glimpses into a reality that had been obscured for decades. Pieces of a puzzle that, if carefully examined, hinted at what really happened. A story far more complex, eerie, and unsettling than anyone had imagined. Sometimes mysteries aren't solved because the truth is gone. They persist because it keeps slipping through our fingers, teasing us with just enough to keep curiosity and fear alive. Chapter 24: Why It Was Forgotten. Some mysteries fade because time erases them. Others fade because someone wants them to. In this case, it wasn't just neglect or forgetfulness, it was deliberate. The story was almost erased, buried under silence, secrecy, and selective memory. There were practical reasons. Officials wanted to avoid panic. Families feared ridicule or harm. Media outlets sought more sensational but safer stories. Even locals, traumatized by what they'd experienced, preferred to turn away rather than dwell on the terror. Each choice to stay quiet pushed the story further into the shadows. But there were also invisible forces at work. Locked records, vanishing witnesses, and subtle censorship created a cultural amnesia. The town itself seemed to conspire, teaching residents to hush, to ignore, to move on. What could have been a public reckoning became a personal, private ordeal, remembered only in fragments. And yet, that doesn't make it forgotten entirely. Oddly, the very attempts to erase it left traces, whispers, letters, hints in literature and folklore. Ironically, the effort to suppress the truth ensured that curiosity would eventually return. It was forgotten, yes, but only superficially. The story lingered beneath the surface, waiting for someone to look deeper, to question, to reconnect the pieces. Sometimes, forgetting isn't the end. It's just a pause before the mystery resurfaces. Chapter 25: The Unsettling Legacy. Every mystery leaves a mark, and this one is no exception. Even decades later, the events of that night echo through the town. In the whispers of locals, the fragments of evidence, and the unanswered questions that refuse to die. The legacy isn't just the fear or the vanished witnesses. It's the knowledge that some stories resist closure. They linger in the corners of memory, in private letters, in abandoned streets, in the way people look at shadows. It's a reminder that not all events are neat, explained, or comforting. For investigators, researchers, and curious minds, the case offers a paradox. A wealth of clues, yet no complete answer. Each fragment, the broken clocks, the scorching lights, the testimonies, tells part of the story, but the full picture remains just out of reach, like a shape in the fog. And perhaps that's what makes it enduring and truly unsettling. It challenges our sense of control, our need for explanations, and our belief that the past can be fully understood. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They are meant to haunt, to remind us of the unknown, and to test the limits of our curiosity. So, decades later, the town remains marked. The files may be locked. The media may have moved on. But the story endures, waiting for the next person bold enough or foolish enough to ask the questions everyone else ignored.